Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to session 5 of The Name of the Rose in the Mythgard Academy. Tonight, we're going to see if we can't get through the end of day 1. That is our goal. Of course, it's been the goal for like a couple weeks now, but we'll see how we do. Before we get going, just a really quick announcement I want to draw your attention to. Of course, in real time, it is almost August. And at the end of August, we are preparing for the next season of the Rings of Power, which I think is going to be really interesting. I just came back from Comic-Con where I had a bunch of really interesting previews and was able to have some really fun conversations with actors and showrunners and things like that. So I'm quite interested to see how season 2 pans out after all the conversations that I've had. But in particular, I am looking forward to Rings and Realms. Rings and Realms, of course, was the sort of experiment that we did 2 years ago, experimenting with a different kind of analysis show that we shot in the studio, and Maggie Park and I did. And we are planning bigger and better things for Rings and Realms this year. So we're planning to follow it up, and we would love to sort of expand it somewhat. So in order to enable us to do this, the expansion, first and foremost, is about being able to hire more crew. We had a very small and totally volunteer crew last time. We would love to be able to compensate those folks a little bit and be able to get more help and be able to do more in the pre-production and post-production stages of Rings and Realms. So we have launched a Kickstarter. So if you go to Kickstarter and search for Rings and Realms, you will find this. In fact, I think that this needs to be updated. But yes, indeed, there it is. So people continue to support the Kickstarter, which is wonderful. We have just made our first announcement. One of the other things, of course, that we're looking to do, if we can raise a little bit of money, is be able to bring in some other special guests. We would love this to be more collaborative, to be able to bring in, to do some really awesome interviews and bring in special guests. So anyway, this is, there are lots of big plans going on with Rings and Realms Season 2. So anyone who is interested in supporting this endeavor, I would invite you. I would invite you to do that. So so here we are. Again, go to Kickstarter, search for Rings and Realms, and if you or you can also find the link in on our YouTube page or on our YouTube channel or on the description of the video here. So JJ, I could see if we could get J.R.R. Tolkien as a special guest, but that would be pretty special. And I doubt he'd approve. But in any case, so we'll have several guests who might not be quite so special as that, but they'll be pretty special nonetheless. So, all right. Anyway, just wanted to bring that to your attention. Let us get back into the story here. Okay, hang on a second. I gotta manage my windows. Okay. All right. Let's jump back into things. So we were just getting to the library. We were just getting to the library and meeting the librarian, and we were looking at the code by which the location of the books was indicated. The code which he declined to explain because only the librarian can have that information. Only the librarian is allowed to know how the library is organized and where you can find the different books. And again, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about that is that what we were seeing was a series of signs which point to things, but that pointing was secret, right? Like, I mean, it sort of challenges the very identity of signs, right? And what the signs are supposed to do. Like, the words exist, these symbols exist only to point to something. but you're trying to control who can interpret those signs, right? And that is a really important question. The control over the interpretation of signs. Who has access to the information that can be used to decode a sign? That issue is an enormous one in the history of the Christian Church, of course. This has a lot to do, for instance, with the translation of the Bible into the vernacular and that sort of thing. But anyway, so that's where we finished last time. Let us think about imagination and fantasy, and look at the illuminations of our late friend Adelmo, right? Isn't it Adelmo, the dead monk? The first half had already been covered with writing, and the monk had begun to sketch the illustrations along the sides of the text. The other pages, on the contrary, were already finished, and as we looked at them, neither I nor William could suppress a cry of wonder. This was a psalter, that is, a collection of psalms, in whose margins was delineated a world reversed with respect to the one to which our senses have accustomed us, as if at the border of a discourse that is by definition the discourse of truth, there proceeded, closely linked to it, through wondrous allusions in enigmate, a discourse of falsehood on a topsy-turvy universe, in which dogs flee before the hare and deer hunt the lion. Little bird-feet heads, animals with human hands on their back, hirsute pates from which feet sprout, zebra-striped dragons, quadrupeds with serpentine necks twisted in 1,000 inextricable knots, monkeys with stag's horns, sirens in the form of fowl with membranous wings, armless men with other human bodies emerging from their backs like humps, and figures with tooth-filled mouths on the belly, humans with horses' heads, and horses with human legs. And this paragraph, as you may remember, goes on for quite a long time after that, describing bizarre and fanciful object after bizarre and fanciful object. Now, I have called this fantasy because this, by the rigid definition of the word fantasy, as that word was used in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, this is fantasy. So let me touch on this. I know I've touched on this at various points in other places, but this is a really important distinction, and it's one which we have lost in our modern usages of these words. We might call these imaginative, images, at which point the medievals would be like, well, duh, right? Because that's a generic word. The imagination is the mental faculty by which one is able to picture a thing that is not there. Okay. So if you close your eyes and you picture a room in your house in which you are not sitting, right? Or a piece of furniture, right, that is out of your line of sight. I'm giving those examples because I'm like shooting for something super prosaic, right? If you close your eyes and imagine a can of Pepsi, so long as there is not, in fact, a can of Pepsi sitting in front of you, right? You're using your imagination. That is being imaginative. It simply means the capacity to conjure up images in your head, right? Fantasy is a subset of imagination. Imagination, again, is the faculty for creating images. By the way, this is a really important distinction because that is imagination. Imagination is the thing that differentiates beasts from plants, right? And like barnacles and things. Aristotle says that that desire is the cause of motion, right? Anything that moves around of its own will does so because it has desires, right? So if you have an animal which moves around, which can locomote, right? I don't mean is migratory or something like that. I just mean like is not rooted to the ground, right? If you've got an animal that can move around, why does it move around? It moves around because it wants things, right? And it moves around because it wants things. And if it wants things, that means that it has imagination, right? If you've got an animal that says, like, I would like some food, there is no food right here. There might be food, so I'm holding in my head the image of food, which is not present to me, right? So I'm going to go fetch myself some food. Compare this, for instance, to the life of, say, a barnacle. Right? A barnacle is attached to a rock, and the barnacle is just sitting there, waiting. Right? The barnacle does not, so far as we know, have imagination. Right? It's not like, oh, that last bit of plankton I ate, that was super good. I'm going to go find myself some more plankton. No, it's a barnacle. So what does it do? It just sits there. And it's like, hey, a piece of plankton appears. It can sense the plankton, right? It's like, great, that's a nice juicy piece of plankton. I'm enjoying that piece of plankton. Hooray, the plankton is here, and then it's gone. And it's like, there is no plankton. I know of nothing, right? It can't imagine the plankton. Whereas, again, like your dog, when your dog is expecting a treat, has a very clear mental image of what it wants, right? Or if you say a particular word to which your dog responds, right? You may not actually be going for a walk at that moment, but if you say the word walk, right? Even if you're sitting on the couch, you will conjure up in the mind of your dog, right, an image of that thing which it desires, and it will then locomote itself, right? It will then move in order to achieve that desire. So that is imagination. And again, it's an important part of like the great chain of being. It's what differentiates, beasts, like higher beasts from lower beasts, or from plants. Okay. So that's what imagination is. All humans have this capacity of imagination. Now, fantasy is different. Fantasy is a subset of this. If you conjure up in your head an image of something which you have never seen, then you are using fantasy. So again, you conjure up an image in your head of something which is not currently there, right? Caloris, as you suggested, it's like an object permanence thing, right? Exactly, Mighty Felix. So there are kind of two subsets actually of fantasy, right? One is to conjure up in your mind an image of something you've never seen before but could be, right? So, for instance, I have never. Well, it's hard because we've seen images of places we haven't been, so that's kind of difficult. In the old days, that is like before the internet, and even before television, a metaphor you could use is like, imagine a medieval person would say something like, I have never been to Paris. I have heard of Paris, right? But I have never been to Paris. So I have an image in my head that I call Paris, right? But it's fantasy. It's not, I'm conjuring up an image, but it's an image of something I've never seen before. I'm making up that image and associating it with Paris based on things that I've heard, right? It's a little bit harder, as I say, now that we know things. So Mighty Felix, that's one application of fantasy. But true fantasy, like pure fantasy. Yes, Belfengos, when we picture in our heads characters and places from books, absolutely, yes. You are using fantasy in that sense. We would call that imagination, perhaps, but that's not, well, again, that's true, but that's too generic, right? It's fantasy, specifically. But the sort of purest and most extreme application of fantasy, and this is what most people are talking about, most medieval and Renaissance people, that is, are talking about when they use the term fantasy, is when you picture up in your mind things that no one has ever seen, things that cannot be. This is when, Mighty Felix, you are imagining a green sun, right? When you imagine a green sun, you are using fantasy in this classic sense. Is it specifically visual? Yes, primarily visual. They didn't differentiate. Technically, it's all of the senses. It's any of the senses, but the word imagination is based on the word imago because they were primarily thinking about visual images, but it does apply to all the senses. So it would be using fantasy, for instance, if you imagined a sun that looked like our sun, but that, was cold instead of hot, right? Gave off cold instead of, felt different, but looked the same. That would still be an act of fantasy. It would certainly be an act of fantasy, to imagine I don't know, like a fresh baked loaf of wheat bread that smelled like eggs, or like boiled eggs or something instead of like bread. That would be an act of fantasy too, right? Yes, if you are remembering a smell, if you remember a smell from your childhood, you are using your imagination. Yes. Memory is very closely connected with imagination. By the way, that's another thing, isn't it, that differentiates animals. A squirrel will remember at least some of the places where it buried its nuts before, right? Because it has imagination. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Yes, Maureen, Umberto Eco is intensely interested in semiotics. So this whole book is a study in semiotics, which is one of the reasons. I mean, that's very clear. Like I didn't have to know that about Umberto Eco to see that in this book, right? As we're reading it through. But yeah, okay. So what is remarkable about what Adelmo has done in his illustrations here is these are fantastical images. But now let's look at, there's lots of ways in which fantasy can manifest itself, right? It can be really simple, like you have corresponded with a person that you've never met in person, and you imagine what that person looks like. That's an act of fantasy, but that act of fantasy is not the same as imagining animals with human hands on their back, or, humans with horses' heads and horses with human legs, right? Those are different kinds of things, right? So, by the way, before I get back into the passage, little side footnote. With this distinction between imagination and fantasy in mind, and this is, I know, Mighty Felix, what you were thinking of before talking about green suns. You can see the kind of heritage of this sort of thinking in Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. When Tolkien talks about fantasy, he's not simply using the word in the old sense, in this sense. He doesn't consistently lean upon the distinction between imagination and fantasy in this old and traditional way. But you can see the distinction there. Jocelyn says, it seems like we're exposed to fantasy from birth these days. Was it different in the Middle Ages? No, it was not. Fairy tales and stories are almost always fantastical. Keep in mind, a story does not have to be unrealistic to be fantasy. It just has to be something that hasn't actually happened. All fiction is fantastical, by definition. All fiction is fantastical in this sense. Now, again, they would draw a distinction, right? The further you go away from reality, right? Like, so again, think of the sort of spectrum, right? The sort of imaginative spectrum between, I'm picturing a can of soda in my hand right now, right? Even though it's not there, or like I'm thinking about and longing for my armchair, right? Bilbo is participating in imagination, right? When he is thinking about sitting next to his fireside with the kettle just beginning to sing, right? So you've got that on the one hand. To memory, remembering, because those are things you could get, right? I could actually get a can of soda in my hand, right? I could actually go sit in the armchair, right? Bilbo does return to his hearth in Bag End. Then you have things like memory, which are imaginations of things that do exist and that you have seen before but are inaccessible except through imagination now, right? And then you've got the fantasy of where you are telling or hearing a story of something which absolutely could have happened but has not happened, right? It's a fictional story, but it's a realistic fictional story, right? That's still fantasy. It's still over the line, but it's not quite so far over the line as like the more extreme version of I'm going to make up a story where the sun is green, right? And where magic happens and, where there are people, humans with horses' heads and horses with human legs, right? Where you change the rules of the entire world in this special imagination, right? In this particular act of fantasy. Those four examples I just give, you see what I mean by the kind of spectrum, and think about what is the variable along that spectrum, right? The variable is how separated from our actual current experience it is, right? From mere object permanence on the one hand, right? Those things really exist. In fact, they really exist here in my house. I'm just not seeing them right now. They're out of my line of sight. All the way up to I am thinking of things which not only are not in this world but cannot be in this world. So yeah, that's the gradient there is how separated from the real world, from our primary world experience, is this thing, right? And Adelmo's illuminations are on the raggedy edge, right? They are extreme versions of fantasy. This is a reveling in this capacity of fantasy. Now, interesting question here. Cal Elros was asking, would they consider a depiction of King David in medieval armor as fantasy? Or is that a different category? They would. It's totally fantasy, because, as everyone except Calvin says, they'd never seen King David, so it would definitely be fantasy. That's exactly correct. But yes, I agree with Eric that the medieval armor would just be assumed, and they would see this as just a depiction of King David. If I gave those four examples, right? Sort of adhering to those examples, to imagine that there's a fake system, there isn't. I'm just making it up as I go along right here. But in my four examples, they would consider that a category 3 piece of imagination, right? That is it's like realistic fiction. It would be like realistic fiction. By the way, imagining something which had actually happened but which you hadn't seen might be somewhere kind of in between my second and third examples, right? That is, the second example you remember was a memory of something that you had seen but you couldn't possibly get back to, like a memory from your childhood, is the second category. And my third category was like a piece of realistic fiction. Something like I'm imagining King David, a story about King David, would be probably somewhere in between those two, because you would say this is a thing that happened, right? They believed that that was fact, but you hadn't seen it, right? So if you're picturing it in your head, you are using fantasy, not imagination, or not only imagination. You're using that special kind of imagination. And yes, I agree, the medieval armor would just be assumed. They wouldn't be conscious of that. If anything, that makes it realistic. Realistic fiction, or, a realistic story. Them trying to picture what an ancient Israelite king might actually have looked like, how he might actually have dressed, what weapons he would actually have used in combat, and all that sort of thing. That would actually be a further, a flight of fantasy with which I actually think they would have been less comfortable. Yeah. It is a piece of fantasy that we modern people love. And in fact, we wouldn't even think it fantastical. We would call it realism. They would call it fantasy. Because it's us imagining something that we can't see and haven't seen in our experience. Okay. All right. Karina is asking a question on Twitch. Let me see. All right. She says, first, looking at these fantastical figures, I see they are composed of things that are known, just put where one would never expect to see them, or what would be highly unlikely, if not impossible. So would one say that most fantasy is made up of known things put together in unreal ways? Yes, exactly. That's why fantasy is a subset of imagination, right? Green Sun, and this is very close to how Tolkien talks about it, right? In On Fairy Stories. You can imagine a green sun, and that's an act of fantasy, right? But you've seen the sun, right? And you know the color green. You've not seen those two things combined in your actual world, but it is not a huge leap to put them together. And that is exactly the kind of... So not only is that exactly the kind of fantasy that's happening here, I believe, Karina, that that's exactly how people would... Like, they would say all fantasy is based in that way. It is this relationship between fantasy and imagination that is, in an act of fantasy, we merely rearrange those things that we have seen. Which again, keep in mind, think about that spectrum again. When you are picturing the face of your pen pal whom you've never met, right? You're probably imagining a face that is vaguely like faces you've seen. Like, you're probably imagining that your pen pal has like probably one nose and presumably two eyes, and right, you know what I mean? Like, it's you're not gonna probably not gonna be imagining that your pen pal will turn out to be something quite entirely different, right? And the same is true of fantasy, right? We still, yes, Belfangos, as you say, we build with the blocks and bricks of things that we've seen or experienced. Yes, and we can see explicitly how that is. In fact, notice how these things, how that kind of grows through these descriptions, right? We can see different kind of versions of how those relationships of images and reality, and, like the reality that we know and acknowledge, our real primary world, we see how those are being shifted, right? Notice the examples here. We have a picture of dogs fleeing before the hare and a deer hunting the lion, right? These are scenes quite like reality, but reversed, but just twisted in this one way, right? The animals are literally just turned around, and going in this other way. Little bird feet heads. Animals with human hands on their back. So an animal which is like a normal animal in every way except that it's got a human hand sticking out of its back, right? Okay, right? So again, it's very similar, but has this one twist in its way that's kind of like the, reversal of the dogs fleeing before the hare. Zebra striped dragons. They believe dragons were real, so it's the zebra stripes that's strange about dragons. I think that's generally true. Dragons are complicated. Dragons are complicated because dragons are a very, very frequent... Well, okay. I won't say frequent so much as powerfully used symbol for evil and the evil one. From the serpent in Genesis to the dragon in Revelation. That is, the dragon is used as a symbol so often that it's really hard to tell sometimes when medieval people are talking about dragons, whether they're talking about like real dragons or whether they're talking about like symbolically speaking, whether they're thinking allegorically, right? So anyway, it can be, dragons are complicated for that reason. But yeah, anyway, monkeys with stag horns, humans with horses' heads. So again, we see all of those variants, right? Variations. Okay, so as I say, this is Adelmo's illustrations, his illuminations, are on the far end. This is pure fantasy that he is indulging in here. Now, there are two things that we need to notice. And I think the amount of time we're spending on this slide augurs really well for our odds of finishing day one tonight. That's okay. It's okay. I'm not in a hurry. Are you in a hurry? I'm not in a hurry. So, two things that that it's important, I think, for us to notice about this. One, you will recall that I made several allusions earlier on to the remember where we've just come from, right? Well, not just come from. We talked to the herbalist in between. And Jocelyn, I saw your reference before to the likelihood of Adelmo having partaken of some of the special herbs that the uninitiated are not supposed to talk about. But before that, we were talking to Ubertino about heresy, right? What, and you may remember I asked the question, what do heresy and fantasy have in common? Do you see now what fantasy and heresy have in common? Both of them are signs that point to things which are not. Both of them tell lies. Both of them describe non-reality. Yes, they are signs of things which are not real. Now, I am not in any way saying that those two things are identical, that heresy is fantasy and fantasy is heresy, right? But the two of them rhyme uncomfortably. And therefore, fantasy has a this very fact. Once you get, as you move down that spectrum of imagination that I was describing, and you start to get further and further separated from reality, the further you get, the more uncomfortable people start to become. In the Middle Ages, like that's different people will draw the line in different places. But you always, sorry, I'm sure you've noticed over the years that I have developed in like decades as a teacher a kind of tick. Whenever I use the words never or always, I pause and I'm like, is the sentence I'm about to say going to be true? But I think it's true. Well, no, I'll back off from it a little bit. There is... never mind. There is always, to some extent, a kind of pressure to justify imagination of those kinds. Why? This is where, so one of the arguments in that was frequent in the Middle Ages. I actually did a whole bit on this as part of my PhD. One of my minor areas was on that I was examined on for my oral exams for my PhD was on traditions of scriptural interpretation, and in particular, what I was interested in was how people discussed and talked about like when fiction is and is not okay. There were a lot of people who had problems with literature, with the use of fantasy in that way, because all literature is fantasy. All stories are fantasy. All fictional stories are fantasy. And even all true stories. Even if you're reading an account of a true story that's being told by an eyewitness, and so therefore for him it is merely imagination, right? Not fantasy. He's telling you the things that he saw. Those are his memories, right? But it's asking you to use your imagination, right? It's asking you to use your fantasy because you've never seen it, right? You may never even have seen France before, much less, the Battle of Agincourt. So, well, that's a later one, obviously, but the Battle of Poitiers or Crécy. And so when you're reading Froissart's Chronicles, even if you trust Froissart, the historian, implicitly, that he is telling you exactly things that he has seen, things precisely as they happened, and if you believe that, never mind. But anyway, even if you assume, right, that there's no fantasy involved on the chronicler's part, there certainly is fantasy involved on your part as you're reading it. So even there, and yes, that would include things like the Gospels, Belfingos. That's why it's so interesting, right? That's why it's so interesting to look at the traditions of how people talked about this. Because you can't get along in the world saying, okay, everybody, never use fantasy. It's not okay. Nobody can say that. I mean, you can say it, but it doesn't make any sense, right? So Jocelyn, but you see, because it's true even as a reader, right? The Word of God, and we're coming back to that. That's the second point that I want to make from this slide. Even if the Bible is the absolute Word of God and therefore totally reliable and totally authoritative, and therefore deeply connected with reality, even in a sense defining reality, when you're reading the story of the gospel, right? When you're reading about the Sermon on the Mount, when you're reading about Jesus's crucifixion, you're using your fantasy because you didn't see it. You weren't there, right? So again, you can't condemn fantasy in general. And in fact, of course, many teachers, interpreters of the Bible, and moral teachers were very overt, firm. They really featured exercises in fantasy, right? This is one reason, by the way, you can thank Saint Anselm, 12th century dude, for the crucifix. Jesus's body nailed to the cross, the crucifix, the Catholic crucifix with the body of Jesus on it. That didn't become a thing until about the 12th century. The crosses were empty before then. It was Saint Anselm who initiated that. And the reason that he initiated that was that he thought it was important for people to be able to imagine, for people to be able to use their own fantasy and their own imagination. He wanted to stimulate people's fantasies to imagine the human suffering of Christ on the cross. That was the suffering of Christ was an important doctrine at that time. Why? That's super complicated and not relevant right now. But again, the point is, so you put the image there, right? The image of the suffering Christ nailed to the cross, so that now they can use their imaginations. They don't just, it's an assistance to your fantasy, right? Because you have that image to help you get started, right? You've not actually seen it, but you've seen a statue of it, right? And that gets your fantasy revved up, and now you can take it from there, right? With that little inspiration, your own fantasy can then, in your meditation and contemplation on the death and suffering of Christ, dwell on that, right? Right, Maureen, exactly. It's more realistic in putting an image in your mind. Exactly what it's kind of doing. Again, if you think about the spectrum I was describing, it's kind of scooting that active fantasy down a little bit, down the spectrum towards reality and away from pure fantasy, right? Yeah, exactly. And it's linked with memory. Yeah, exactly. Now it's still fantasy, right? I mean, you've got that one image, but it's only one image, right? Anyway, it's, so yes, the idea that you're using fantasy and reading the gospel, again, that I think that some of you are thinking that sounds like something that you would imagine medievals would find that scandalous. They would find it far less scandalous than it sounds to you, because we don't use the word fantasy this way anymore, right? In our vocabulary, if something is fantasy, that means it's not true, right? And so I think that's the issue that some of you are having. Like if the word fantasy, which means it's not true, is attached to the Gospels, then that calls their doctrine into question, doesn't it? No, it's not inconsistent with their doctrine at all, because the word fantasy, it doesn't mean that. Again, like you're using fantasy when you're saying, gosh, I would really love to go to bed right now, right? I'm really tired. I wish I could go to bed. When you're longing for a glass of water, you're using your fantasy. That has nothing to do with, lies and things. Yeah, Steve, that's a really good distinction. Seeing the crucifix isn't fantasy. Treating it as pointing to Christ's suffering is. Exactly. Looking at the crucifix is not even imagination. That's just perception, right? And if you fix your gaze upon it as you worship, you can think about that thing. But most likely, that's going to start you thinking about other things, right? You're not just going to be thinking about the silent and still image, right? But it's going to prompt more imagination, more fantasy in their sense of the word. Yeah. It's complicated stuff, isn't it? Yeah. Now, the second thing I wanted to emphasize. So the first thing I wanted to emphasize is I wanted to say, let's remember that connection with heresy. It's fantasy is useful. Fantasy is essential. It's one of the things that defines us as human beings. It's a fundamental capacity that we have and we will always use. Like you can't legislate against it, right? That's not possible. But that doesn't mean that it can't lead you astray back to heresy, right? If you follow your fantasy can easily lead you off the path, lead you to ideas and conceptions that are not only different from reality, but are simply contrary to it, which are lies. Like you can believe there's fiction and then there are lies, right? And if you think about those categories, even in our terms, there are many similarities between the two categories of lies and fiction. In fact, we use those two things as synonyms at times, right? Lies of the poets. Exactly, JJ. Lies of the poets. That's precisely why the fox in Till We Have Faces theoretically objected to poetry, right? Yeah. So that's one thing that I want to remember. That's at risk here. When fantastical things of this kind are being, that is, we're on the extreme end of that spectrum of imagination that I was describing here in Adelmo's Illuminations. And we have to keep in mind there's risk here, right? There's risk here. Here's the second point I wanted to make. And it relates to many of the things that we've been saying about the Bible and the authoritative Word of God. Notice that. Notice what Echo emphasizes here. These are not just. Adelmo wasn't like drawing a comic book or a graphic fantasy novel. What was he doing? He was illuminating a psalter, the Bible, right? He was drawing these images, in Adso's words, at the border of a discourse that is by definition the discourse of truth. They are called illuminations. What does that imply? That implies that the pictures on the side shine light upon the text, right? And the pictures that are being drawn are fantastical. Adso himself is very much sensitive to the irony, the kind of tension, as if at the border of a discourse that is by definition the discourse of truth, there proceeded, closely linked to it, through wondrous allusions in enigmate. In enigmate, get out our little Latin translators there, a discourse of falsehood on a topsy-turvy universe. Like in an enigma, right? In a mystery. So there's the discourse of truth in the text, and there is a discourse of falsehood on a topsy-turvy universe in the margin. And those two things are being closely linked through wondrous allusions in enigmate. The images are making allusions to what is in the text, but they're enigmatic allusions. They're mysterious. They're not obvious allusions. That is, Adso believes there is a link here. He believes, or assumes, that Adelmo wasn't just doodling in the margins of the Bible. That he is discoursing. Discourse is an important word, right? A discourse is an argument, right? Is propositions put forth in order, put forth in sequence, in order to move you from thinking about one thing to thinking about another thing. That's what a discourse is. And just as the text is a discourse of truth, the marginalia contain a discourse of falsehood on a topsy-turvy universe. Falsehood in that sense of gap from reality, right? Things that are not so, things that are not true. And yet, Adso again either assumes or believes, or even possibly perceives, that there's a connection between the two. What connection between the two, and how are they connected? Well, it's in Enigmate. He would have to meditate on this to figure it out. But there could be a link there, right? So that's how, anyway, that's sort of how he perceives this here. Yeah, it is a puzzle in a sense, Eric. Yeah. Like any other enigma is a puzzle. Note 2. William and Adso's reaction. They respond with a cry of wonder. Adelmo was good. His illustrations are amazing. Literally amazing. They are amazed. They cry out in wonder when they see this. I have an idea. Move on to a second slide. They are wonderful. Everyone except Calvin. Absolutely. Good for you, Adso, the librarian continued. In fact, these images tell of that country where you arrive mounted on a blue goose, where hawks are found that catch fish in a stream, bears that pursue falcons in the sky, lobsters that fly with the doves, and 3 giants are caught in a trap and bitten by a cock. And a pale smile brightened his lips. Then the other monks, who had followed the conversation a bit shyly, laughed heartily, as if they had been awaiting the librarian's consent. He frowned as the others continued laughing, praising the skill of poor Adelmo and pointing out to one another the more fantastic figures. And it was while they were still laughing that we heard at our backs a solemn and stern voice. Verba vana aut risui apta non loqui. Okay, before we get to the killjoy at the end of the slide, notice how this works. The result. Laughter. The link between fantasy and laughter. Why do they laugh? Why does anybody laugh? What is laughter? What incites laughter? What is humor? Wherein is the essence of comedy? What makes us laugh? I think I agree, Eric. The juxtaposition of things that don't go together. Expectation and the twist from that expectation. Tension. The kind of tensions that we might describe as irony, of different kinds of irony, dramatic irony, for instance. The unexpected or contrary to the norm, the subversion of norms. Yes. The disappointment of expectations, or the frustration of expectations, right? You're set up to expect one thing and you see something else instead. And that there's an intellectual tension there, right? In that perception of the misfit, right? The thing which isn't the thing that you were expecting. You expect a different thing, right? You get something different than you expected. And that unexpectedness is... think how close amusement is to discomfort, right? Think how many times that line, in your experience, that line has been crossed or blurred. Think how many times you've been simultaneously amused and uncomfortable, right? Yeah, there's and yes, I see Maureen and Eric thinking a lot about thinking about lies and heresy. Yeah, there's a similarity there, right? Yes, Mighty Felix, the kind of nervous laughter, right? Or again, think about slapstick comedy. In a sense, laughter is always kind of a thing of the nerves, right? In one sense or other. Anyway. Yes, so much of comedy is offensive. Absolutely. Absolutely. And offensive comedy is... there's something like, I don't know, almost intrinsic to the comedic situation there. I'm not saying everyone has to like that kind of comedy, right? Everyone has to enjoy that. But again, it's that tension, it's that disjunction. Exactly, Emily, that's a really important thing. Something isn't comedy just because it's offensive. Think again of the many times in your life you will have experienced when someone means something for a joke and it falls completely flat. Not in the sense of not being funny, right? But in the sense of being merely offensive or, sad or whatever, right? Yeah. Jocelyn, your quote of Elizabeth Bennet there, follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. Yes, exactly. What I would draw attention to there, Jocelyn, is Elizabeth Bennet's statement of her. It's a quote from Pride and Prejudice, of course, for people who don't recognize it. Elizabeth Bennet's statement there speaks to her own choice and will, right? I laugh at them whenever I can, right? She chooses. And of course, Jocelyn, as you will remember, think of the scene later in the book when Elizabeth says, "Oh, yes, I am excessively diverted," right? When her father is telling her something which he believes she will laugh at and instead brings her pain instead of amusement, right? Anyway, again, just a marvelous illustration of this whole thing. We will have occasions to be thinking about laughter. There's a lot of discussion of laughter here at the end of day one. But the thing that I think is important here is the link. The librarian's discussion of these fantastical things, right? And when he says "good for you, Adso," he's responding to Adso's quotation. Remember, Adso quotes something in Middle High German, right, which is Adso's native language, and the librarian he knows the quotation and completes the quotation, right? We're not going to do. Sorry, Eric, we're not going to do the Middle High German quotation right here, but that's what he's responding to, and he seems to approve of this kind of fantasy, right? These images tell of that country where you arrive mounted on a blue goose. That country. There's something in his use of that phrase, that country, that reminds me of Tolkien, right? That sounds like that puts me in mind of On Fairy Stories, right? He speaks of that country as if this is a country that exists. It's not our country. He is speaking of a fantastic country. And yet, he's speaking of a country as if, in a sense, it were real. But it's an alternative world, right? It's a world that's detached from our world. And when thinking about that country and describing it, where all the rules are different and, bears pursue falcons in the sky and that sort of thing. A pale smile brightens his lips. And when he smiles, thinking about these fantastical things, the tension between the reality that he knows and this, it's funny. It's funny to imagine lobsters flying with the doves. That's funny. And it's funny. It might make us laugh because of that. Like, it creates that tension. We feel the tension between the fantastic world and the real world, right? We perceive the difference, and that tension sort of resolves itself with laughter. He smiles. Then the other monks, who had followed the conversation a bit shyly, laughed heartily, as if they had been awaiting the librarian's consent. They find this kind of fantasy. They find Adelmo's illuminations delightful. They've been restraining their laughter. But when they see the librarian smile, he's going there, right? And so his indulgence in the smile gives them a sort of permission to laugh. Yes. Yeah, Mighty Felix, you're talking about that too. When we have the urge to laugh, but we have to suppress it. Yes, exactly. This is important, as we're about to see, right? Notice the librarian himself frowns as the monks are laughing, right? They're laughing and praising Adelmo's skill and pointing to his pictures as they laugh, right? The librarian does not totally approve of this. And his pale smile turns to a frown. And then we get the words of the one who disapproves of this even more. Verba vana, aut risui, apta non loqui. It is better not to speak vain words. Aut risui, I'm forgetting, or I forget risui. Right, out equals or. Yeah, that I remembered. Vain words or to laugh. Right, yes. Yes. This is a quotation from the Benedictine rule. You're not supposed to say vain words, and you're not supposed to laugh. This is, what's his face? The old grumpy blind dude. I'm blanking on his name. Somebody will remind me. Joachim. Is it Joachim? Joachim was the... Jorge. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Joachim is the heretical dude, Joachim of Fiore, the one that Ubertino, whose writings Ubertino liked and was really upset that they got declared heretical. Yeah, Jorge. Yeah, okay. It's Jorge. Okay, anyway. I hope my words did not anger you, the old man said in a curt tone. I heard persons laughing at laughable things, and I reminded them of one of the principles of our rule. And as the psalmist says, if the monk must refrain from good speech because of his vow of silence, all the more reason why he should avoid bad speech. And as there is bad speech, there are also bad images, and they are those that lie about the form of creation and show the world as the opposite of what it should be, has always been, and always will be throughout the centuries until the end of time. But you come from another order, where I am told that merriment, even the most inopportune sort, is viewed with indulgence. He was repeating what the Benedictines said about the eccentricities of St. Francis of Assisi, and perhaps also the bizarre whims attributed to those friars and spirituals of every kind who were the most recent and embarrassing offshoots of the Franciscan order. But William gave no sign of understanding the insinuation. The eccentricities of St. Francis of Assisi I don't know if any of you have heard stories about this. St. Francis of Assisi used to do things like go out and preach a sermon to the sparrows, for instance. Like he would preach sermons to the birds. That would be one of the eccentricities of St. Francis of Assisi, right? The Benedictines are a little bit more straight-laced than that, right? Yeah, okay. Notice what he says, what Jorge says here in condemnation. The spirituals, remember, Ubertino was one of the founders of the spiritual movement, subset of the Franciscans. But don't focus on the politics here. Focus on the ideas. Notice how he's not saying in condemnation of laughter and of Adelmo's images, he's not saying anything that we didn't already say, right? It's why are the images bad, according to Jorge? They lie about the form of creation and show the world as the opposite of what it should be. Well, yeah, that's literally exactly what the librarian just said about them when he was smiling, right? They do say something that is removed from merely a description of the form of creation, as it is, has always been, and always will be. Yes, that's the point, right? Notice how, again, think about what I was saying before about humor and about laughter. Think about telling a joke or hearing a joke where there was a disconnection, right? When you tell a joke and somebody just doesn't get it, right? Or when you're watching, you've ever been in a room where you're watching a movie and one person in the room is like laughing uproariously at what's happening on the scene. The other person is like, this is horrible, and is like feeling like increasingly traumatized as they're watching it. Ever had that experience before? Right? That's exactly what's happening here. Both are perceiving the same thing, but they're thinking about it very differently. Right? They respond to that. Both are perceiving the disjunction. Both of them are feeling that kind of intellectual tension between, expectation and result, right? Between, what you like, the norm and what you see, right? All those things we were talking about, which is like what makes funny things funny. So Emily, no, not exactly like that. What I'm describing is not like when somebody gets a joke and the joke goes completely over other people's heads, like being a parent and watching Pixar movies with your kids. No. I mean, that is a thing, but that's a different thing than what I'm describing. What I'm describing is, two people are watching the same thing. They are perceiving the same disjunction. They're perceiving the same tension, but that tension makes one of them, moves one to laughter, and it moves the other to pity or even horror. So I'm very familiar with this situation because I have this with my wife all the time. There have been many a time when I'm laughing at something and my wife is like, I don't understand how you can possibly laugh. That is horrible. Yes. That's the kind of thing. I mean, again, we're both perceiving the same thing, right? We're both perceiving the same thing, but we have a completely different experience of it, right? This is what we're seeing here with Jorge. He's perceiving exactly the same thing. He says it in almost the same words, right? They show the world as the opposite of what it should be. Well, yeah, yes, Jorge, that's in fact the whole point, right? Yeah, exactly. But in him, it arouses scorn. And in the librarian, to a small extent, and to the other monks there in the scriptorium, to a larger extent, they experience it completely differently. Yes, Jocelyn, that's exactly it. Somebody slips in the mud and cracks their head. One person laughs, another person is like, "Oh no, that's terrible." Yeah, exactly. Slapstick comedy will, divide the room like this pretty sharply, right? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the point, the thing that I think is so important about this, for this book, is that the sign is the same. What it's pointing to is being perceived by both people. But their reception of that is completely different, right? It's another illustration of how complicated the relationship between sign and thing is. And we should also be remembering, as somebody was I forget who was bringing this up before, but yes, somebody was bringing up the question of allegorical interpretation. It was in relation to the dragon stuff I was talking about before, I think. But yes, so in connection with that sort of thinking, right? Think of the different ways in which that things can be taken, the way that things go. Anyway, yeah. We'll see more of this. There's tension here between the Benedictines and the Franciscans, or at least between Jorge and the Franciscans. William, of course, will remember as a Franciscan. William's going to try argument. Marginal images often provoke smiles, but to edifying ends, he replied. As in sermons, to touch the imagination of devout throngs, it is necessary to introduce exempla, not infrequently jocular. So also the discourse of images must indulge in these trivia. For every virtue and for every sin, there is an example drawn from bestiaries, and animals exemplify the human world. That's William's brief defense of Adelmo's images, right? Notice what he says. Now we know we can follow exactly what he means when he talks about touching the imagination of devout throngs, right? In order for a preacher in a sermon, which were given in the vernacular, by the way, in order for a preacher to speak to the congregation, and like what he's trying to do is he's trying to inform their imaginations. He is trying to get them to hold in their minds, right, the things of God. He's trying to get them to think about virtue, which hopefully they will have seen before, right? He's trying to get them to think about God, whom they will have encountered before in various ways, though not usually with their physical senses, which means imagination is the more necessary, you see. But imagination and fantasy, You can't conceive of God without fantasy, because we haven't experienced him directly in that way. But in any case, in sermons, as people are trying, as a preacher, right, as a priest, is trying to edify, to teach, to build up, literally what edify means, right? He needs to touch their imagination. And he does so through fantasy, introducing exempla, that is, telling stories, fictional stories, parables and things, right? Parables, even fables. Not infrequently jocular. A funny story is even more effective in a sermon. Why? Because it helps you to remember it, and therefore to keep before your imagination these devout things. So also, the discourse of images must indulge in these trivia. Images can do the same thing. Images can also tell stories, not infrequently jocular, in order to be memorable, in order to point to these things, in order to stir the imagination. For every virtue and for every sin, there is an example drawn from bestiaries, and animals exemplify the human world. Right? These are all exempla, examples, stories. Yeah. Here's Jorge's response. I know that line of reasoning, and I confess with shame that it was the chief argument of our order when the Cluniac abbots combated the Cistercians. But Saint Bernard was right. Little by little, the man who depicts monsters and portents of nature to reveal the things of God per speculum et in enigmate. Per speculum, which literally means through a mirror, but like through a reflection of things, a speculation. That's where speculation comes from. The word speculum in Latin literally means mirror. But through a mirror, like through a glass darkly, and in enigmate, and in a mystery, right? So if you're trying to reveal the things of God indirectly through these means, by getting people to imagine things, if you're trying to tell stories, if you're trying to depict images which somehow reflect the truth about God, per speculum, through a mirror, or to get people to imagine it in enigmate, through a puzzle, through a mystery, right? So if you depict monsters and portents of nature to reveal the things of God in this way, a man who does this comes to enjoy the very nature of the monstrosities he creates and to delight in them, and as a result he no longer sees except through them. You have only to look, you who still have your sight, at the capitals of our cloister, and he motioned with his hand beyond the window toward the church. Before the eyes of monks intent on meditation, what is the meaning of those ridiculous grotesques, those monstrous shapes and shapely monsters, quadrupeds with serpents' tails and fish with quadrupeds' faces, and here an animal, and I skipped a whole bunch there, and here an animal who seems a horse in front and a ram behind, and there a horse with horns, and so on. By now it is more pleasurable for a monk to read marble than manuscript, and to admire the works of man than to meditate on the law of God. Shame for the desire of your eyes and for your smiles. The warning is about mission creep, essentially. You start out doing this for a good reason, but you end up loving these things for their own sake. Notice his counter-argument here. Fundamentally, yes, these things might be used as a means to an end, right? You might use fantasy, fantastic stories, fantastic images. You might use that as a way to direct people's imagination, people's minds and imaginations onto the things that they should be focused upon. But in doing that, you've got a means and ends problem, Jorge says, right? You are trying to get people to contemplate the truth by means of getting them to consider a lie. And in the end, what you're doing is drawing their attention to lies. And what this is very likely to end in, Jorge would say inevitably ends in, is contemplating the monstrosities themselves, taking pleasure in the monstrosities themselves. It isn't that stories and fantastic images cannot be used for a good end. It's that they always become ends in themselves. And now it is more pleasurable for a monk to read marble than manuscript. You're not being directed to the law of God. You are instead admiring the works of man. Kind of like those monks looked like they were just doing. Oh man, look at that. Adelmo's a genius. That was awesome. Do you see that Adelmo picture? They're contemplating Adelmo's work. They're not meditating on the law of God. Right. Yeah. Shame for the desire of your eyes and for your smiles. Remember the little problem Adso was having when Ubertino was condemning sin in excruciatingly pornographic detail? Remember? And Adso's thoughts were not being directed towards sanctity, right, by the manner in which Ubertino condemned vice. They did not arouse virtuous thoughts in him, recall? Similar problem, right? Think about the similarities of that situation with what Jorge is describing here. It's difficult. It's complicated. Let's keep going. One of the monks speaks up. "Venerable Jorge," he said, "your virtue makes you unjust. 2 days before Adelmo died, you were present at a learned debate right here in the scriptorium. Adelmo took care that his art, indulging in bizarre and fantastic images, was directed nevertheless to the glory of God, as an instrument of the knowledge of celestial things. Brother William mentioned just now the Areopagite, who spoke of learning through distortion. And Adelmo that day quoted another lofty authority, the doctor of Aquino, Thomas Aquinas, when he said that divine things should be expounded more properly in figures of vile bodies than of noble bodies. First, because the human spirit is more easily freed from error. It is obvious, in fact, that certain properties cannot be attributed to divine things, and become uncertain if portrayed by noble corporeal things. In the second place, because this humbler depiction is more suited to the knowledge that we have of God on this earth. He shows himself here more in that which is not than in that which is. And therefore the similitudes of those things furthest from God lead us to a more exact notion of him, for thus we know that he is above what we say and think. And in the third place, because in this way the things of God are better hidden from unworthy persons. In other words, that day we were discussing the question of understanding how the truth can be revealed through surprising expressions, both shrewd and enigmatic. And I reminded him that in the work of the great Aristotle I had found very clear words on this score." Jorge is about to interrupt him at this point. Did you follow those arguments? Let's go through them just a little bit here. Why is it not only okay, but in fact better, good? Why? So basically this argument says fantasy is a necessary means. If the end is contemplating God, then fantasy, he says, is a necessary means to that end, not just an imperfect means. It is imperfect, right? It is not a rival, as Jorge was suggesting. It is better. It is necessary. So point number one, because the human spirit is more easily freed from error. He's quoting Thomas Aquinas saying, divine things should be expounded more properly in figures of vile bodies than of noble bodies. note on vile versus noble. He's not talking about class. Vile doesn't mean disgusting, and noble doesn't mean either virtuous or upper class. He means like great and glorious things versus small and humble things. Like an example of a vile body would be like a toad or a stick or something simple, like a simple physical object is a vile thing. Whereas like an angel would be a noble thing, a noble body, or a stone versus a human body. Yeah, higher or lower in nature, Eric, is a good way to say it. So if you compare the problem with thinking about, it's like you could try to envision God, you can try to understand God, you could try to imagine God in the figure of a noble body. So that as you can say, so God is kind of like a person, right? He's kind of like a human. Imagine a human like this, and that'll give you an idea of God. You can do that, and that can be helpful, but there's a danger there. And you can also imagine God as, like a rock, right? Or I'm thinking of like the metaphor that C.S. Lewis uses to describe the relationship between the first two persons of the Trinity by describing a stack of two books sitting on a table, right? That is using vile bodies in order to try to understand. It's a good example of trying to use vile bodies in order to describe God, right? Why would Aquinas say that it's more useful to imagine God as a stack of books than it is to imagine God as a human? Because you're unlikely to mistake a pile of books for God, right? But you could mistake a person for God, and people have done so, right? It is obvious that certain properties cannot be attributed to divine things. Like, you're not going to mess up. The means and the ends are going to be clear, right? You're not going to mistake the sign for the thing. So that's the first point of his argument. That's one reason why it's better to use signs. It's better to use symbols. Let's see. In the second place, because this humbler depiction is more suited to the knowledge that we have of God here on this earth. He shows himself here more in that which is not than in that which is. Do you follow that? Let me put it this way. What is God like? Traditionally, if people describe what God is like, they tend to use negatives. Yeah, as Carrie says, reality is defined by its limits. Exactly. So, like, God has, no body. God is. So, like, here's one example, right? One example of a sort of a comparison with God. I'm forgetting whom I'm quoting here. Quoting somebody, but I can't remember who it is. Might be Aquinas, but I don't know that it's Aquinas. So, anyway, God is like a circle with its circumference nowhere and its center everywhere. That is an old dictum describing God. Not very practical in its way, right? It's like a circle with no circumference and whose center is everywhere. Yes, and all of those negatives: immutable, unknowable, unimaginable. Yes, exactly. In all of these ways, God shows himself here more in that which is not than in that which is. Because of God's infinitude, another negative, we can't just say, this is what God is like, because God is more than anything else, right? So that, again, in order to conceive of God in any way, this argument goes, you have to use fantasy. You've no other option. He shows himself here more in that which is not than in that which is. That which we can see. God may be like many things that we know, or many things that we've seen, but he is not that. That does not encompass him. Empedocles, Maureen? Okay. Who centers everywhere and circumference nowhere? Okay. It's an image that gets used a bunch. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So that's the second argument. That again shows that, like, if so, Adelmo would argue, therefore, like, if Adelmo weren't dead, he would argue, in fact, apparently he did argue, that images like the ones he's drawing, impossible images, fantastic images, bring us closer to contemplating, to meditating upon the nature of God. A picture of a horse with human legs in this way gets us closer to imagining God than just a picture of a horse, describing nature as it always has been, is, and always shall be, right? As Jorge would like, right? We can contemplate the horse, and that can lead us to contemplate God in some ways. This happens in the Psalms, in various places, that sort of thing, right? But it's not enough. God is not a horse, right? Nor is he very much like a horse. Anyway, so again, that's how sort of that bit of argument would go. Third point. In the third place, because in this way the things of God are better hidden from unworthy persons. A very medieval argument. The virtue is that many people won't understand them, which is good, because the secret truth about God, you can't just let that out into anybody's hands. This is why only the librarian can go into that's one of the reasons why only the librarian can go into the library. We'll come back to this point. We'll come back to that point. I was going to try to do one more slide, but then I saw what the next slide is. And I'm not going to do that. Because next it's time for us to meet the glazier, the master glazier, and to talk about magic. And that's a whole other thing. So let's wait and talk about magic next time, I think would be better. But here's a prediction. Next time, we're totally going to finish day one. It's so going to happen. In fact, so confident am I that I encourage you to read at least the first section of day 2. Yeah, no, I think Prime would be a little bit ambitious, but you could at least read Matins on day 2. Devorah, I am confident that we'll finish day 1 next time. It's almost certain, because we're so likely to spend less than an hour on the first slide is the main thing. That's why I'm not addressing it right now. There we go. Okay, so and yes, I will be here next week for those of you who are attending live. I say with perhaps rash confidence that I will be here next week. In fact, August will be I'm doing very little travel. I was traveling constantly in 3 out of the 4 weeks of July. I'm not going anywhere in August, probably. Well, I'm only going to go one place briefly in August prior to going to Seattle to see First Fish and Cal Elros and my friends up there in the Pacific Northwest for Cascade Moot at the very end of August. But before then, there's only one little jaunt that I'm likely to make, and I don't exactly know when, unless we're very unfortunate and that happens to fall on a Wednesday. When I go to this unscheduled as yet thing, we should have Wednesday class all through the month, I think. So we'll see. We'll see how things go. But next week I'm planning on, for sure. All right. Very good. Well, thanks everybody for joining me, and I will see you guys again next week as we talk about magic and get all the way through the end of day 1 without any problems. Thanks everybody. Bye now.